The papers arrived on a Thursday at 9:14 a.m. in a manila envelope. The courier pressed directly into Adize Okafor's hands without looking at her face. She signed for them standing in the doorway in her house slippers, the ones with the worn-out heel that Victor had told her twice she needed to throw away. She carried the envelope to the kitchen table, set it between the pepper grinder and the fruit bowl, and sat down. She sat there for 11 minutes without opening it. Then she opened it. The first page told her that Victor Chukwemeka Okafor, after 30 years and 4 months of marriage, was seeking a dissolution of their union on the grounds of irreconcilable differences. The second page listed the proposed division of assets. His name appeared on 17 of the 23 listed items. The third page was a letter from his lawyer, a man named Gerald Fasanya, whose address was listed as 14 Bordeaux Road, Lagos Island, advising her that she'd 14 days to respond through her own legal counsel. There was no handwritten note from Victor. There was no phone call. Just the envelope, the papers, the pepper grinder, and the fruit bowl. Adize set the papers down and went to make tea. She did not know what was going to happen next. But she knew where she had been, and she knew what she had kept, and those two things were enough for a Thursday morning. She was 54 years old, 148 pounds. She had gained the weight slowly over 3 years, not from carelessness, but from the particular stillness that had settled into the house since their youngest child, Dyke, moved to Port Harcourt with his wife in 2021. She wore a house coat she had bought for 1,400 naira from the stall at the entrance of Makola, market run by a small woman named Comfort who always threw in an extra piece of fabric free. The housecoat was faded now, the original blue gone to the color of sky seen through glass, but she washed it carefully by hand in cold water every 4 days to preserve fabric, and it had never once been worn with a stain. She was the kind of woman who washed things carefully. Everything she had owned a long time. On the kitchen shelf above the bread box, there was a small clay pot her mother had pressed into her hands the week before. She died in 1998 at the family house in Enugu. Her mother had kept dried thyme in it for 40 years. Adize kept the same pot on the same shelf and kept dried thyme in it still, though she had replaced the thyme 7 times over the years, and each time bought it from the same market stall she had found the year she arrived in Lagos, because the woman there dried it properly, and the smell when you opened the pot was the same smell as her mother's kitchen. The pot had a small chip on the lip from the move to Lagos. In 2003, the year Victor's company expanded its territory and they left the neighborhood she had grown up near and came to this house. She had wrapped the pot in a cloth and carried it in her lap the entire 4-hour drive. When she dusted the kitchen, she dusted the pot last, slowly, the way you handle something that holds more than it appears to. She had been the accountant for Victor's trading business for 27 of their 30 years together. Not as an employee, as a wife. There was no salary. There was no formal title. There was the understanding, unspoken and never examined, that what she did with the numbers was part of what kept the household running. And the household included the business, and the business was Victor's name. She kept the books by hand first, in a green ledger she bought from a stationery shop near their first apartment. Then in spreadsheets she taught herself to build from a computer manual she borrowed from the public library in 2001, and never returned because every time she finished one chapter she found herself in the middle of the next. She had a mind for numbers the way some people have a mind for music, not learned from study alone but already there when she arrived, sharpened by use until it was precise and effortless and invisible the way the best tools are. She could hold an entire column of figures in her head and tell you within 30 seconds where the discrepancy was and what had caused it. Victor had known this. In the early years he had told people proudly, "My wife can find a missing naira in a mountain of receipts." In the later years, after the company grew and he hired a formal accountant and started attending dinners where the other men had secretaries who accompanied them to present proposals, he had stopped mentioning her mind for numbers. He had stopped mentioning most things about her. His secretary's name was Blessing Ease. She was 31 years old and had worked at Okafor Trading Solutions for 4 years. Adize had met her exactly twice. Once at the company Christmas party in December 2022, where Blessing had been introduced as one of our key team members by Victor in a voice Adize had not heard him use about anyone in their household in some time, and once in October 2023 when she brought Victor his blood pressure medication because he had left it at home. She had driven to the office herself, parked in the visitor's bay, and carried the medication to the reception desk. Blessing had accepted the small paper bag from her hand without standing up from her chair, set it on the corner of the desk, and said she would make sure Mr. Okafor received it. She had not said thank you. She had not said Mrs. Okafor. She had looked at the paper bag the way you look at a delivery that arrived through the wrong door. Adesi had driven home and made lunch. She had not said anything about it to Victor when he came home that evening. He had come home at 9:47 p.m., later than he had said, and ate his dinner warmed in silence. She had asked him if everything was all right with the contracts he had mentioned that week. He had said yes. Fine, it was sorted. She had washed the dishes and gone to read. These were the kinds of evenings they were having by then. She had been cataloging them in a separate way from the accounting records, not on paper, but in the particular stillness of a woman who is watching the shape of a thing change and is deciding what she is going to do about it. What she had done about it, starting in February of 2019, was keep the folder. The morning after the envelope arrived, she went to the study, opened the bottom drawer of the wooden filing cabinet, the one that stuck slightly and required you to lift the handle while you pulled, and took out the accordion folder. Inside were 34 printed pages, organized in 5 sections with color-coded tabs she had cut from a stationery set. Section 1 was the accounting records she had maintained from 2014 to 2023, cross-referenced against the company tax filings Victor had submitted to the Federal Inland Revenue Service. The filings, as she had first noticed during a routine reconciliation in July 2019, diverged from the actual records in patterns that were small enough individually to attribute to rounding, but were systematic enough in aggregate to mean something deliberate. She had documented every instance. There were 41 of them. The total figure represented was 8,420,000 naira over 9 years, moved in amounts between 48,000 and 630,000 naira at intervals designed to stay below the reporting thresholds. Section 2 was a current market valuation of their house, conducted by a licensed property firm in April 2022, which placed its value at 47.3 million naira, not the 28 million Victor's lawyer had entered on the settlement proposal. Section 3 was a letter from Victor's business partner, Emmanuel Nwosu, dated February 2020, which referenced the receivables issue Adesi flagged in August. 3 words that documented her role in the business in someone else's handwriting, someone who could not later claim she had contributed nothing. Section 4 was a copy of the deed to a property in Lekki Victor had purchased in his name alone in 2018 without mentioning it to her. Section 5 was the certificate of registration she had filed 6 weeks earlier for a company named A Financial Consulting Services, registered to an address on Osu Oxford Street with a placeholder logo she had sketched in pencil on the back of an envelope one evening after Pauline's phone call, a simple monogram inside a circle, unfinished, waiting. She sat with the folder in her lap for a long time. The kitchen was quiet except for the refrigerator's low sound and the street noise from outside and the pigeons on the roof across the way. She had made tea and let it go cold. 30 years is a long time to be in a place, even when the place has been wrong for some of it, even when the mornings have been the kind of mornings that sit on your chest like a weight you are not allowed to name. 30 years fills up a person's life in ways that a 14-day response deadline cannot account for. She was not crying. She was counting, the way she always counted when something needed to be measured before it could be moved. If this story is already sitting in your chest the way I think it is, subscribe now, because what Adesi does with those 34 pages changes the direction of everything that comes next. She called Pauline Achebe that afternoon. Pauline had been her closest friend since secondary school in Enugu, a big-spirited woman who laughed loudly and cried in equal measure, and had moved to Accra 8 years ago after her own divorce from a man who had, in Pauline's words, confused her patience with permission. She ran a fabric business from a converted warehouse in the Tema area now, and she answered the phone on the second ring, as she always did for Adesi, as if she had been sitting in a place where she could hear the call before it started. Adesi told her what had happened. She read the key details from the papers flatly, without pausing, the way she read figures from a balance sheet, each item given its full weight, without dramatization. When she finished, Pauline was quiet for 4 seconds. Then she said, "The folder," Adesi said. "Yes," Pauline said. "Tell me what's in it." Adaze read from the folder for 11 minutes straight. When she finished, Pauline was quiet again, longer. Then she said, "Do you remember what I told you in 2014, when you first mentioned those discrepancies?" Adaze said she remembered. Pauline had said, "Keep a record of what you know, not for revenge, because the truth has nowhere to live unless someone builds it a house." Adaze said, "I think it's time to find it a house." The lawyer she called the next morning was a woman named Constance Owusu-Boateng, recommended by her neighbor, Mrs. Amaka Nanaji, a retired secondary school teacher who had won a property dispute in 2019 against her late husband's. Relatives and who had, when she heard what had happened, appeared at Adaze's door at 7:30 a.m. with a container of egusi soup and the lawyer's card held between two fingers, like it was a document of its own. Constance Owusu-Boateng had offices on Lagos main island and had handled 47 divorce and asset disputes in 6 years. 31 of her clients had been women over 45 who had been presented with settlement proposals. Their husbands' lawyers had structured to minimize what the women walked away with. She had won 31 of them. She asked Adaze to come in on Monday at 10 a.m. and to bring everything she had. Adaze came in with the accordion folder, a USB drive containing every spreadsheet she had built since 2001, and the green ledger book from their first apartment. Every household and business item recorded in her precise, near-mechanical handwriting from 1994 to 2002, 412 pages, not a single month missing. She set them on Constance's desk and sat with her hands in her lap. Constance picked up the ledger book. She turned 3 pages. She went completely still. She set the book back down. She looked at Adaze. "How long have you kept records like this?" "Since before we were married," Adaze said. "My mother taught me." Constance held her gaze for a moment, then reached for the accordion folder and began reading from section 1 without speaking. She read for 26 minutes. She asked 2 questions. The first was about the methodology Adaze had used to identify the filing discrepancies. The second was about the provenance of the Emmanuel Nwosu letter. Adaze answered both precisely, from memory. Constance wrote 2 lines of notes. Then she closed the folder and said, "Gerald Fasanya is going to have a difficult few weeks." The 14-day response deadline passed while Constance was preparing the counter notice. On day 12, she filed it, citing inadequate asset disclosure, requesting a full financial audit of Okafor Trading Solutions Limited dating back 9 years, and appending a preliminary summary of the documentation Adaze had provided. Victor's lawyer called Constance's office twice before noon on day 13. Constance did not return the calls that day. She called back the following morning at 9 a.m. exactly, a precision that Adaze would later learn was one of Constance's deliberate practices, answering in her own time at the hour of her choosing. Victor called Adaze directly on the 24th day. She heard the phone ring from the study and let it ring 4 times before she answered. He said her name in the tone she recognized, the warm, slightly lowered register that had once meant tenderness, and had later, after she learned to read it fully, come to mean that he wanted something he believed she would give him because she always had. Her shoulders used to rise when she heard it, a physical response she had not been able to prevent for years. They did not rise now. He said he believed they could work this out between themselves. He said the lawyers were turning something personal into something adversarial. He said he still had respect for her. He said 30 years deserved better than papers and counter notices. He said he had made a mistake, not specifying which one or how many years it had taken to become the thing it had become. She listened to him for 3 minutes and 40 seconds, watching the digital clock on the study desk as he spoke. When he finished, she said, "Victor, I'll be in touch through Constance." Then she said goodbye and ended the call. She set the phone on the desk. She looked at the filing cabinet, at the empty space in the bottom drawer where the accordion folder had been before she took it to Constance. She pressed both palms flat against the desk surface. Outside, a bus ground passed on the road and pigeons moved on the roof, and a child somewhere called out something she could not quite make out. Ordinary sounds, the world continuing in its ordinary way. She sat with her hands flat on the desk for a while. The settlement took 19 days of formal negotiation. On the evening of the 3rd day, Victor's legal team revised the house valuation upward to 39 million naira. On day 7, they acknowledged the Lekki property in the asset disclosure. On day 11, they withdrew the tax filing matter from the scope of the settlement discussion entirely. A move Constance noted to Adizi afterward, quietly, was not the same as making it disappear. It was a way of saying we acknowledge it exists. On day 14, Victor's lawyer proposed a revised split of 60-40 in Adizi's favor for the liquid assets. Constance responded the same afternoon with a counter that noted the 27 years of undocumented labor contribution and appended the Emmanuel Nwosu letter. On day 19, Adizi Okafor signed a settlement that gave her 51.2 million naira in cash and property assets, full ownership of the Lagos family house, and a written acknowledgement. On Victor's company letterhead, bearing his signature and the company's seal, that her contributions to Okafor Trading Solutions Limited between 1994 and 2023 had been substantive and material to the company's operation and growth. That final item had not appeared in any of Victor's proposals. Constance had drafted it on day 16 and sent it across at 4 p.m. on a Friday. Victor had signed it without requesting changes. That was the detail that told Adizi everything she needed to know about what he had always understood. She walked out of Constance's office on a Tuesday at 3:47 p.m. The sky was white and flat, the kind of Lagos afternoon that feels like the city is holding its breath before the rain. She stood on the step for a moment with her bag over her shoulder and the signed papers in Constance's office behind her, and 30 years already, becoming a thing that had happened rather than a thing that was happening. Then she walked to her car, started it, and drove home. At the kitchen table, she opened the laptop. AO Financial Consulting Services had a registered address, a business account with 45,000 naira in it, seed money she had moved over 6 weeks earlier from her own savings, and a pencil sketch of a logo she had never designed properly. She found the card in her wallet between a supermarket receipt and her library membership card. A graphic designer named Tobena Adeyemi Bright, whose card she had taken at a community business exhibition in November because she liked the font he used on his own materials. She called the number. The logo took 9 days and 3 rounds of revision. Tobena presented it as a small, clean monogram, the letters stacked in a thin circle, a line weight that was neither heavy nor timid. He sent 3 color options. Adizi had asked for something in the color of good soil after rain. The first option was it. She did not need to look at the other 2. Her first client came through Pauline, a palm oil processing facility owner in Accra named Kwadwo Mensah, who had not been able to reconcile his accounts for 3 consecutive years because the person who had kept his records had left suddenly without documentation or transition. He sent Adizi's 847 pages of mixed files, bank statements, invoices, payroll sheets, customs forms, supplier contracts, handwritten receipts, and photographs of physical ledgers someone had scanned at an angle. She worked through them for 11 days at the kitchen table, 7 hours a day. On the 5th day, she found the first structural error in how his income categories had been separated, an error that had been compounding through every subsequent record for 2.5 years. On the 8th day, she identified 2 instances of internal payment irregularities that had together cost the facility 1.3 million cedis he had not been able to account for. On the 11th day, she submitted a 46-page reconciliation report and a forward-looking bookkeeping system with instructions she wrote at a reading level that assumed her client was intelligent but not trained in accounting. She billed him 320,000 naira. He paid in 4 days and sent her the name of a business owner in Tema with the message, "She is suffering the same problem. She needs exactly what you did for me." All Financial Consulting Services had 3 clients by the end of its 2nd month, 7 by the end of the 4th. By month 6, Adizi had taken on a part-time assistant, a young woman named Shidinma, who was completing her accounting degree and who sat across from Adizi at the kitchen table for 2 weeks learning the methodology before they moved into the Osu Oxford Street office properly. The office had a single room, 2 desks, a shelf unit, and a window that looked out onto the street. Adizi moved the clay pot from the kitchen at home to the shelf above her desk in the office. She wrapped it in the same cloth she had used since 2003. She set it in the corner of the shelf and put dried thyme in it, bought from a market she found 2 streets away that dried it the right way. The morning she hung the sign outside the office, a small rectangle with the AO monogram and the company name in clean black letters. She arrived at 7:48 a.m., which was earlier than she needed to be there. She stood outside and looked at the sign. Then she went inside, made tea, and opened the laptop. In January, a mutual friend mentioned in passing that Victor had married Blessing Ease in a private ceremony. Adaze received this information on a Wednesday afternoon, while in the middle of a reconciliation report for the school's supply business she had taken on in month 5. She noted it. She finished the reconciliation. She sent the report. She made tea. She called Tyke at 8 p.m., as she did every evening. They talked for 40 minutes about his daughter's first steps and a book he was reading and whether she was eating. Well, which she was. She did not mention what she had heard. It was not a secret. It simply did not require a place in the conversation. The way a stone removed from a path does not require you to carry it with you. You simply walk forward on the cleared ground. What Victor Okafor did not understand, when he signed those papers and handed her the envelope and removed her from the life they had shared, was that he was not taking something from her. He was releasing her towards something she had been building toward for 27 years without knowing. She was allowed to build toward it for herself. The 34 pages in the folder were not weapons. They were records. The truth written down in careful handwriting, kept in a drawer, waiting not for an enemy, but for the moment it would be needed. The world does not always recognize what it is standing in the presence of. A woman in a faded housecoat at a kitchen table is invisible to most people. She is unremarkable. She is background. She is 30 years of morning routines and meals cooked and accounts balanced in the margins of someone else's name. But the ledger she is keeping in her head, and sometimes on paper, and sometimes in an accordion folder with color-coded tabs, that ledger is real. It has been adding up for a long time. You cannot take what a person carries inside themselves, not the knowledge built from 40 years of careful practice, not the memory of their mother's hands pressing a clay pot into theirs and saying, without saying it, that this is the thing that will outlast everything else, the skill, the patience, the precision of someone who has learned to count. Some things cannot be seized by a lawyer or listed on a settlement proposal. Some foundations go too deep to touch. The people who believe they are handing others an ending are often, without knowing it, handing them the key to the door that opens only from inside. On a Thursday morning in April, exactly 6 months after the manila envelope arrived, Adaze Okafor sat at her desk in the Osu Oxford Street office with 11 active clients, a part-time assistant, a clean set of company accounts, and her mother's clay pot on the shelf above her head. The sun came through the window at an angle that caught the thin circle of the AO monogram on the wall and threw its shadow across the desk in front of her in a small clean ring. She picked up her tea. She worked. Before you go, I want to ask you something real. If you had been carrying a skill like that for 30 years, doing the invisible work, keeping the invisible records, holding the whole thing together from a place no one gave you credit for, and someone handed you an envelope and told you it was over, what would you build? Not what you would buy with the settlement. What would you build with what they never managed to take? Leave your answer in the comments. I want to read it. Subscribe for more stories about hidden strength, quiet power, and the people the world overlooks until they change everything. I'll see you in the next one.